you to take us back to October 3rd, 1979. You were state senator, so if you could just start by telling us a little bit about your responsibilities as state senator, what towns your district covered, on which committees you served, just to set the stage.
Mm-hmm. Well, in '79, I was serving on the Education Committee. I was chairing the Education Committee. And the towns included Windsor, Windsor Locks, East Granby, Suffield, Enfield, and Somers. And at the time of the tornado, I was in a classroom. My full-time job at that time was as a high school teacher. And I think the tornado struck around 3 p.m. And school had dismissed. Students had gone home. I was in the classroom, probably correcting some papers or something, and some students came by for a visit, and we're sitting down when we had this terrific storm. And the high school, if you recall, is in the southwest end of Windsor Locks, which is close to the Turnpike Road, now named El Agrasso Turnpike, and getting nearer to the Pequannock section. And it was one of these storms. I remember mentioning to the students, oh, we're going to read about this tomorrow. There'll be some trees knocked down. There'll be water in people's cellars. It's quite a thunderstorm. And shortly thereafter, one of the students went down to the office where they had a police scanner. And he came back and he said to me, you know, they think this was a tornado, and that it struck the airport. And so I thought, well, I think I'd like to get out there and see what's going on. So I got into my car, left the high school, and drove toward the airport. And at some point, the road was blocked off. I couldn't go any further. So I got out of the car, and a former student who I recognized was riding by on a motorcycle. And I said to him, you mind taking me in? I want to see what's going on here. Can I ride with you? And he said, sure. And the police let us go. I showed them my identification. And I went right into the area that had just been hit. And it was really alarming. And I began to think about people I knew in the area, and it was a lot of damage. But I couldn't continue that because there was just too much destruction. And so I rode back on Route 75 up to North Street in Windsor Locks, and then went down North Street and went home. But that evening, I contacted a number of people, and they said, yes, we'll take you through now. And it was after dark. And we drove into Windsor on Route 75, and we drove into the neighborhoods that have been devastated, the residential neighborhoods. And I was really shocked by what I saw. It was much worse than anything I had ever seen on TV about a tornado. The whole neighborhood smelled like a lumber mill. You could smell the wood having been ripped open. And I researched in more recent years the nature of that tornado. And at the time on Google, they were claiming that it was a Force 5, which is the worst tornado that you can have. Far worse than most that you see on TV. Most that you see on TV peak around 3. This was a 5. And the article that I was reading said that while tornadoes in New England are rare, when they occur, they can be very strong. I think they may have downgraded it to something between a 4 and a 5 nowadays, but it was considered at that time, this is perhaps 15 years ago, I think it was considered one of the most expensive ever in the United States, and one of the few Force 5 tornadoes. So it was a monster of a tornado. And when you toured the area immediately after it, and that evening, and could smell the wood, and could see the devastation, it was really extraordinary. And the the following Sunday, I think the tornado might have occurred. Was it on a Friday that the tornado occurred? Possibly.
I'm not sure.
It was a Wednesday.
Wednesday, okay. But the following week, I went through the neighborhood when the people had returned to sort of sort through. And what again amazed me was that the neighborhood was wide open. There wasn't a structure. The trees had all been flattened. The bushes were all gone. It was just wide open, as if it were a farm field with foundations placed in it. And many of the foundations had been completely scrubbed of anything that was in them. Most of us have basements loaded with stuff that we don't know what to do with. These basements were cleaned out. And by cleaned out, I mean the furnace was gone, the hot water heater was gone, the washer and dryer were gone. That was the power of that tornado. And it looked like a newly poured concrete foundation. And there was one fellow who I was talking to, and he was raking through the debris. And he had a wooden rake with wooden teeth in it. And he was raking through that debris, and the debris was going through the teeth of the rake. And he said that was what remained of his house. It could fit through the teeth. And I said, well, you know, what about the washer and dryer and solid things of that nature? And he said, all gone. No sign of them. They may have been reduced to small fragments. And I asked him why was he raking through this material. He said he had a gold coin collection. And he was looking for the coins. And I thought, that's a hopeless thing. But he said, no, I've already recovered 2 or 3 pounds this morning. And so he was just, you know, bit by bit, going through the remainders of his house with a rake to find gold coins. So that really gives you an idea of the scope of the devastation, how thorough it was. And I asked him, is there anything that I can do for you? And he said, well, we've already got word that temporary housing was going to be coming in. And he said, you know, anything you can do to accelerate that. But that was well on its way. And he also said, you know, we could use some porta potties up here, because many people are coming back looking for lost articles. And I said, oh, of course. And I began to see how could I secure porta potties. And I think I called the Department of Environmental Protection, because they ran the parks, the state parks. And whoever I got over there said, well, we do own porta potties, but it's October. They've all been taken out of the parks. And I said, well, where are they? And they said, well, the Department of Transportation came and picked them up. So I called the Department of Transportation and I said, we need porta potties. Where are they? And they said, well, we picked them up, but we brought them to administrative services for storage. We don't have custody of them. All right. I called the Department of Administrative Services. Now, this is a state senator calling. And the Department of Administrative Services said, oh, well, yes, we've stored them, but we are not permitted to release them because they are owned by Environmental Protection. Well, by the time that occurred, now we're getting late at night and everybody was going home. So the following morning, Ella Grasso would come up early every day. She was on the scene. She was the governor. And she would hold a briefing in the conference room of the Windsor Locks police station. And so I would go to these briefings every morning. And on this particular briefing, she was sitting at a large table with all of her commissioners, DOT, DEP, administrative services, etc. And she finished with them, and she looked up at the officials lining the room. The mayor of the town was there, the selectmen, all standing around. And she said, "Is there anything else? Does anybody else have anything to say?" And I raised my hand, and I said, "Governor, they need porta potties in the Pequannock section." And she said, "Oh my God, they don't have porta potties up there? Oh, I would have thought they did." And she looked up at her commissioners and she said, "Well, who can take care of that?" "I will, Governor, I will, Governor, I will, Governor." 5 commissioners. "I'll take care of it, I'll take care of it." She just pointed to one and she said, "Okay, you can do it." And I thought, I'd spent the previous day getting the runaround. I can imagine what an average citizen would have gotten. I was identified as a state senator. And the amusing thing about that, if there was anything amusing in this time of the tornado, it was a lesson to me of the importance of having the chief executive on the spot in a crisis. And I remembered that some years earlier, the Governor Meskel had been skiing in Vermont on the school holiday when the state had been hit with an ice storm. And wires had come down and the state was pretty much without electricity. Some places were up to 3 weeks. And they contacted the governor, and the governor had said, "Well, I'm in close contact with my emergency management people. I'm up here skiing with the kids. It's their school vacation. I don't think there's anything more I can do by coming to Connecticut." And, you know, in my own mind, I agreed with him. I thought at that time, based on my limited experience, I was a young teacher, and I thought, well, yeah, what can he do? Well, that incident in the tornado taught me what the chief executive can do. Point to the people in charge and say, "Get that done." And they jump, and they do it. And I thought of it again when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, and President Bush, while he was interested, was not located on the scene. And I think, again, had the chief executive been there, things move more quickly. And so that was a lesson to me. I thought that does help. It really does help. And maybe the governor should have come back from Vermont in retrospect.
Well, take us back to that first motorcycle ride where you were, you know, this was your first view of the disaster, and a couple of, paint us a picture of, you know, just like, what were you thinking? You're, you know, this is your district, you're a state senator. What were you thinking, like, what, and were there people? Did you see people? Or was it really just the...
Well, I went up, you know where the high school, I mean, most of your viewers probably know where the high school in Windsor Locks is located, on South Elm Street. And I believe what I did was get over to Southwest Avenue and then Halfway House Road, working my way toward the Route 75, the road that runs along the airport. And I began to see increasing amounts of debris. A tree knocked down, a wire across the road. and we were going around these things, and the police were blocking off Route 75. And I got past that. They permitted me to go past that when they knew that I was the state senator. And I wanted to see the heart of the damage. And I was noticing along Route 75 the damage, and it was considerable in the Air Museum, which I subsequently became president of. The president of the board was just looked like it had gone through a blender. And that's when it really hit me that this really is a tornado. This wasn't just high winds. This really was a tornado. I got down about as far as the bank just over the Windsor line on Route 75, and there was a cemetery just beyond that, and I saw that all the gravestones had been knocked flat, and the bank looked like it had been blown up. And that's a pretty sturdy structure. That was a brick facing. And at that point I thought it would, I guess the police were saying you really can't go any further than that. It's just too backed up. And so I started heading north again on Route 75, running along the airport. And I saw damage to a number of the commercial structures. And then I had this sort of cold sweat, a little bit scared feeling, because my sister's house was up near the end of North Street. And I thought, God, I hadn't considered somebody close to me might have been in danger. And as we got toward North Street, I saw that down North Street wasn't too bad. And I went a little further to a home, I think it was the Christian family, tobacco growers. And I drove into the driveway because I knew them, and the house had been moved slightly off the foundation, and that was pretty upsetting. So then I really wanted to get to a phone as fast as I could, and it was just as easy to get home. I wasn't too far from that area, and I got home and I got on the phone with the local selectman, and then I called the Capitol and tried to get some information. And I was told that the governor had called for an Air National Guard helicopter and that she was going to get out there ASAP. The first selectman said that he was opening up the police station as an emergency center, so everything was now underway. And the former mayor of Enfield was I think at that time, director of civil preparedness. And he was on the job. He assured me that they were all coming up to get a look at it, see what had to be done. So I was somewhat put at ease that everything was going to be done that could be done. And it was that night that I then toured it in a police car and saw the extent of the devastation, and I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen anything like it, not even on television. And the following day, when the sun was out, and we were up in the Pequannock neighborhood, going through everything, it was just again further driven home that this was a monster of a tornado. And that's when the fella said, "We need porta potties up here," and I got my lesson in the bureaucratic runaround.
Mm-hmm. So in the days that followed, talk about sort of the recovery efforts and how the state helped, and Ella Grasso's role in that.
The state and federal government were very good, and what happened was the state people were all sort of speaking with one voice. They all were working through the governor's office. Again, I think because she was on site, and all of the selectmen, mayors, town managers were in the same room, all speaking with the same voice. And they were in contact with FEMA. I don't know if it was called FEMA at the time, but the equivalent of FEMA. And their response was very rapid. What do you need for housing? Who needs it? And I remember mentioning to the first selectman in Windsor Locks that I'd been up to the Christian property. And I think they had 4 children. And the selectman said, "Yeah," he said, "I think we need to get them an extra trailer." And I went up and told them that another trailer was coming in because of the large family. So things were really moving quickly. I was impressed by the response. You had the federal, the state, and the local government working in harmony. Mm-hmm. And again, I think the fact that the governor had just cleared her calendar and was going there every single day as if it was the only thing that was of immediate concern to her. at that point. And I think she became the traffic cop. And that accelerated the pace. Subsequently, one of the regrets I had was that we didn't organize something to, but nobody was thinking of this, and I wasn't thinking of it either, for photographs and objects that would have been a museum of this event. One of the things I recall that was mind-blowing, if you remember when you continue on 75 into Pequannock, there's a school sort of across the street from St. Joseph's Church and the Congregational Church down there. And that school, elementary school, had 2 basketball backboards, and they were on fastened onto a galvanized steel pipe, and they were at the regulation level, and they were up against, they were in a parking lot, and they were up against an embankment. Both of those basketball backboards and the galvanized steel pipe, the 2 of them had been bent in a perfect arc until they touched the embankment, as if a giant had just taken them and bent them back. And if you think of the power to bend a galvanized steel pole in that fashion, and I don't know whatever became of those objects, but that's the sort of thing that I thought, wow, if that could have been. But you know, I don't know. There weren't a lot of photographers. Everyone was just concerned with the human aspect of it, and the notion that one day we would all want to look back and get some feeling for the power of this thing. So I don't know whether there are pieces around that one day could be collected in a museum or by the Historical Society to demonstrate to people yet unborn what a tornado can really be like. It's pretty amazing.
I heard that there were people who came through and they were curious, and some people had cameras and so forth and so on. And one of the jobs of the National Guard and the police and so forth was to keep that from getting out of hand. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, I didn't see that as a problem because when I went in, you know, there were no idle visitors. It was all cordoned off, and I only got in because of my elected position. But somehow, you know, I was always a photographer. I loved to take pictures, and my camera was always very active. I traveled. I took thousands of slides, and yet it didn't even occur to me to load the film in my camera and take my camera with me. And so all those days that I was going up there and talking to people, it just never occurred to me to bring the camera. I guess it was the tension and the feeling that dealing with the human tragedy was everything. And it's amazing to me. I mean, I would take my camera out if the trees turned a nice color, you know, anything was an excuse to take pictures, and I never took a picture of this tornado. And I look back at it, and I'm amazed that I didn't do that.
Well, when we talked first, you said that you felt that maybe that would be irreverent, and I marked that word. I thought that was really an amazing
I guess that was
word
it.
for you to use.
I guess that was it. I just, I couldn't intrude on people in that way by pointing a camera at them. You know, maybe that was too sensitive. I kind of, in retrospect, wish that I had a few pictures.
You've talked about, you know, the state assistance, the federal assistance. Were you aware of other groups that were particularly helpful in the aftermath of this tornado? Could you talk?
Yeah,
about
I think that everyone opened up to do whatever they could. You know, you hear these stories about people pulling together. I think, for example, the Catholic Church wasn't as badly damaged as the Congregational Church. And I believe they then offered the Congregational Church the use of their facility. So there was that kind of outreach. Many stories of people helping each other and doing whatever they could. It was, and the community certainly came together.
Do you recall the presence of the National Guard, the Salvation Army, the Red Cross?
Oh yes, and I recall the governor's helicopter nearly every day going overhead. They would go down to the Capitol lawn, and they would pick her up on the north lawn of the Capitol. And it seemed every day she took the helicopter, spun around before it came down and brought her to the police station, where again she would hold the morning briefing, what had been done.
And the police station was in Windsor Locks?
The police station was in Windsor Locks. That was the most convenient spot for her.
And this tornado hit Windsor Locks, parts of Suffield,
Right.
parts of Agawam.
Right.
Was there inter-town, sort of communication and recovery efforts that crossed town barriers? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, there were.
Because
There were. I don't think that we involved the Massachusetts folks, but it was very known that everyone would gather at the Windsor Locks police station, the conference room, and everybody would be there because the governor was there, and you were getting the briefing. And as with me, if you had any issue that you spotted that you thought needed tending to, you could bring it up right there, and you were dealing with the top official who could get it done. She could pick up the telephone and call the president if there was a blockage, or for some reason somebody wasn't being cooperative at the federal level. She could pick up the phone and talk to the president very easily. I guess it would have been President Carter. And so there was no blockage. There was no communication problem whatsoever. And all of the towns, certainly Windsor Locks, perhaps East Granby, Suffield, they were all there, all represented.
And who would represent them? Who were the typical people who would be sitting at that briefing?
Oh, well, typically it would be the mayor, the selectmen, if they had a town manager, the town manager would be there. Perhaps the chief of police, I don't recall the exact, but all of the top administrative people of the towns would be there. The people who were getting the phone calls from the citizens and the people that were going out every day and going through the neighborhoods. So I think there was a lot of swift response, and I think the average citizen who had been devastated by this catastrophe, in the end, was fairly satisfied. I did not hear very much complaining at all about the governmental response. I think people thought that it was quick, and it was fairly generous. And I think people were satisfied that everything that could be done was being done. I did not get much feedback. I don't recall a great deal of discontent. Minor things like the fellow saying, well, you better get some porta potties up here. And I think we were a little tardy in doing that. And the governor acknowledged that when I told her, and she said, oh my goodness, I would have thought they were already there. And they immediately got on it. And I think by that afternoon, they had them there.
Were there any other unforeseen things that people needed that you all were able to work on besides the porta potties, the trailers, the FEMA
Yeah,
trailers?
sometimes I think that we were doing everything we could to speed up the arrival of these trailers. But people had been put into motels, and that, of course, isn't a long-range solution. The trailers would be getting the trailers set up on their property so that they could begin to live normally. And as for the rest of it, of course, it was now the question of insurance and financial aid so that they could begin the rebuilding process. But I think that went fairly rapidly. Things were cleared pretty quickly, and the rebuilding process was moving ahead very rapidly. You know, it was a tremendous devastation, but it was somewhat concentrated. So it was the Pequannock section in Windsor that was hit hard, and that was a lot of residential. And then the tornado moved along Route 75, and it began to destroy and damage some of the commercial properties along Route 75. It obliterated the Air Museum, and it began bouncing at that point. And it continued and it came down a couple of spots in Suffield, and I think all the way up into Granville, Massachusetts. I think that checks from the bank on Route 75 in Windsor, checks were found 20 or 30 miles away, well into Massachusetts. So it dissipated, I believe, somewhere over Massachusetts. But it had been bouncing with increasingly large, untouched areas as it went along. But you know, a force 5 tornado really is tremendously powerful. So there was some thought for many years that it was a force 5. I think in subsequent years I rechecked the Google, and I think they were thought perhaps more a force 4, which is bad enough.
Were you aware of any local fundraising efforts, you know, area fundraising efforts that were taking place to try to help people out?
I don't recall anything in particular. I don't recall anything in particular. I think that there was a good deal of federal and state assistance. I think that there may have been, you know, on the periphery, there may have been some fundraising. The church got rebuilt. I imagine there were private funds involved in that, and it got back to a working order in pretty quick time. The whole area.
So lasting effects of the tornado on Windsor Locks.
Well, I think that there, you know, those folks who are involved in emergency preparedness probably got a lot of lessons out of that, and they went through that experience, and I'm sure that that experience is now part of the institutional memory of the State Office of Emergency Management, the local towns, their police, and it's probably come down from that time as an institutional memory in those areas. I think certainly for the people that went through it, it's probably something they'll just never forget. And I don't know whether anybody suffered PTSD after that. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some of that. Nobody used that phrase, PTSD, at the time, but I'm sure that must have impacted people in that fashion, because it was a tremendous trauma. I was only on the periphery of it in the high school, and became very aware of a very strong sort of summer storm. But those people who were in a house that suddenly disappeared must have really carried a scar, I would think, probably to this day.
And we're finding that as we're talking to people. They all
Yeah.
react in different ways. But this is somewhat related, but takeaways lessons learned from all of this?
Well, as I said, my biggest lesson was that the number one person has got to get to the disaster site and has to be part of the response. The number one person has to be there. You can't simply rely on General so-and-so or Commissioner so-and-so. I think you've got to, initially, of course, they've got to respond. But I think the number one person, in this case, the governor, in other cases, the president, has to say, I'm coming, and I'm going to be there. Prepare an office for me. I want to be there. And I think that has an effect on everyone who's part of it. They just have to up their game that much more. And I know that El Grasso communicated directly with the U.S. president at the time. And I'm sure that all of the federal people knew. She was a friend of his. They had been encountered each other when he ran for president. And I'm sure they knew that this was a woman who could pick up the telephone and immediately have it ring on the president's desk, and he was going to take the call. So that probably had a salutary effect on making sure that the things moved along expeditiously, timely fashion.
So is there anything else that we've not talked about? Any memories you have, anything that you think people should know about the tornado? People that didn't experience it, things that people that did experience it?
Well, you know, if you didn't experience it, you were lucky, and you don't want to experience a tornado. I know these tornado chasers find it pretty exhilarating, and I imagine it is, and I wouldn't mind getting a look at one from a very safe distance. But I often think of it now in my own house, which is in Windsor Locks, and I've been living in it for about 30 years, and I think every time we have a heavy summer storm, I just don't want it to be anything like a tornado, because nothing's going to stand up to it. I don't care what you built, Force 4, Force 5 tornado, nothing's going to stand up to it. It could be a poured reinforced concrete house. It's going to sustain a lot of damage.
Jenny, do you have any questions?
No, and every time I had one in my head, he answered it. So I think I love that El Grasso story about the porta potties. That is really a great overall depiction of how strong a leader she was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
I just wish we could, this video could be part of it. I just wish we could have a large room somewhere that was a museum to the tornado, with survivors' interviews and with pictures and objects that convey what this was. Because I don't think people who haven't seen it can really grasp it. I had watched tornadoes on TV. I'd watched the aftermath of huge tornado strikes in the Midwest, but never grasped it
Well, I
like
think that's
this.
part of what you're planning to
part of
bring
what
some
we're-
visuals, not objects, but.
We're finding visuals. People are coming through with scrapbooks and photograph albums, and of course we're getting wonderful reminiscences. And we're thinking of mounting a display at Windsor Historical Society. But then all objects. It's not very easy to find. As you say, I mean, so much was destroyed or pulverized.
Well, they were just interested in clearing it out of there as fast as they could.
Right.
And but you could pick maybe 30 or 40 objects that would just convey the power, like those two galvanized steel poles. I've never seen anything like it. Just as if they were bent on somebody's knee.